In the heart of the 17th century, Europe trembled under the might of a single dynasty, the House of Habsburg. They were emperors, kings, and queens whose power stretched from Madrid to Vienna, from the cold peaks of the Alps to the dusty plains of Spain. But behind the golden thrones and velvet robes lay something far more sinister, a secret written in blood. The Habsburgs were obsessed with purity. Not the purity of spirit or morality, but the purity of blood. Their empire, they believed, was ordained by God, and only by marrying among themselves could they preserve divine favor. This obsession led them to commit the unthinkable, generation after generation of incestuous marriages. It was not only cousin to cousin. Uncle married niece. Aunt wed nephew. Children were born into a web of genetic horror. Into this twisted legacy came a girl named Margarita Teresa. Born on July 12, 1651, in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, she was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. Yes, niece. Her mother was his sister's daughter. From the moment of her birth, Margarita was destined to be used. She was born not for love, but for politics. Her future was already written. She would one day marry her own uncle, Leopold I, to keep the Habsburg bloodline pure. She was royalty raised for incest. Margarita's earliest years were spent in the cold marble halls of the Spanish court. Despite being surrounded by courtiers and servants, she was a lonely child. The weight of generations sat heavily on her tiny shoulders. Every moment of her childhood was documented, recorded, and measured, not because she was loved, but because she was valuable. She was the golden pawn in a centuries-old chess game between kings. Her parents, Philip and Mariana, were not a happy couple. Philip was old, tired, and broken by the deaths of his previous children. Mariana, much younger and unprepared for power, was more concerned with piety than affection. Their union had already produced sorrow. Infant deaths and stillbirths haunted the palace. But when Margarita survived infancy, hope returned to the court. A new Habsburg rose to carry the torch. Yet even as a child, Margarita showed signs of fragility. She was small for her age. Her jaw was slightly misaligned, an early indicator of the infamous Habsburg jaw. She often tired easily, and her complexion was pale. Physicians whispered about her health, but no one dared question royal blood. After all, she was a Habsburg. And the Habsburgs were meant to rule. It was during this time that the great Spanish painter Diego Velázquez entered her life. Velázquez had long served the Spanish court, painting kings, queens, and nobles. But none of his portraits would become as famous as the one he painted of Margarita Teresa. In 1656, he completed Las Meninas, one of the most iconic works in Western art. At the center of the vast, mysterious painting stands young Margarita. She wears a bright, voluminous dress. Her face is pale and poised, her expression unreadable. She is flanked by ladies-in-waiting, dwarfs, and a mastiff, while in the background Velázquez paints the royal couple reflected in a mirror. The painting is enigmatic. Is it a portrait of Margarita or a commentary on royal life? Is she the subject or a symbol? Many historians believe that Las Meninas is a window into the suffocating world Margarita inhabited. A world where appearances mattered more than reality. Where children were pawns. Where beauty was demanded, even if it came at the cost of life itself. As Margarita grew, the pressure mounted. She was trained in court etiquette from the age of 3. She was taught to curtsy, to smile on command, and to hold her tongue. She learned music, needlework, and the languages of diplomacy, Spanish, French, Latin, and the cold silence of survival. But what she wasn't taught was how to be a child. There was no time for games. No room for rebellion. Only duty. By the age of 5, formal discussions began about her marriage to her uncle, Leopold I. Leopold was the younger brother of her mother, making him both her uncle and cousin. The match had been planned from the day she was born. It would unite the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs again, a pure bloodline to strengthen the empire. Letters between Madrid and Vienna spoke of her as though she were property. Quotes from court letters reveal this chilling truth. She is of a cheerful disposition. Her beauty is improving. She will be ready in due time. What the letters didn't say was that Margarita often suffered from fatigue and illness. She complained of headaches. She would sometimes faint. These were brushed aside. Doctors blamed the climate, her temperament, or even her tutors. No one dared speak the truth, that the Habsburg blood was sick. It had been poisoned by centuries of incest. And Margarita was only the latest victim. Her father, Philip IV, grew more anxious as his health declined. His other son, Don Balthasar Charles, had died young. He feared the extinction of his male line. Only Margarita remained as a hope for alliance. She was no longer just a daughter. She was a lifeline. In 1660, when Margarita was just 9, she was officially betrothed to Leopold I. He was 20 at the time. She was too young to understand the full weight of what this meant. But the court rejoiced. The alliance would be sealed. And the blood would remain pure. Yet behind the celebrations, her health was declining. Her body was not growing as expected. Her limbs were thin, her back slightly curved. Her face remained unnaturally pale. Some whispered that she was cursed. Others said she was holy. All were wrong. She was a victim. The Spanish court began to prepare her for departure. She would not travel to Vienna until she was of childbearing age, around 14. But already, the lessons intensified. She was instructed on how to please a husband, how to submit to an emperor, how to present herself as a jewel of the Spanish throne. No one asked what she wanted, because royal children were never asked. As the years crept by, Margarita Teresa was paraded through court festivities, formal appearances, and portrait sessions. More paintings were commissioned to show her beauty and vitality. The truth, her weakening body, her pain, her fear, was hidden behind silks and lace. She was taught to smile through everything, even the horror of her fate. By the end of part 1, we see a portrait not just of a young royal, but of a girl raised in a gilded cage. She was the product of an empire built on incest and control. She was meant to carry the hopes of Spain and Austria. But she was already breaking. The cracks were invisible to most. But they were there. In her bones, in her blood, and in her future. By the time Margarita Teresa turned 10, her future had already been negotiated, signed, and sealed in the corridors of royal power. Though still a child, she was now formally promised to her maternal uncle and paternal cousin, Leopold I, the future Holy Roman Emperor. It was a union that represented far more than marriage. It was the continuation of a dangerous genetic experiment that had plagued the House of Habsburg for centuries. The betrothal was not celebrated with joy, but with political calculation. At the courts of Madrid and Vienna, letters flowed back and forth discussing her dowry, her grooming, her personality, and most disturbingly, her ability to bear children. She was barely past her first decade, yet already being assessed for fertility. This was the fate of a Habsburg daughter, reduced to a womb in waiting. Mariana of Austria, Margarita's mother, took a cold and methodical approach to preparing her child for this role. She herself had been married into the Spanish throne at 15, and she now passed on the same burden. Under Mariana's strict supervision, Margarita's life became a relentless schedule of grooming and obedience. Every movement was rehearsed. Every word was measured. Every expression had a meaning. She was forced to wear tight corsets, long skirts, and heavy fabrics even in the sweltering heat of Madrid. These garments were designed to exaggerate her hips and waistline, presenting the illusion of a maturing woman, even though she was still a child. Her hair was curled and powdered. Her skin was kept pale and untouched by the sun. She was transformed from a living girl into a walking symbol of imperial expectation. At court, ambassadors from Vienna often visited, bearing gifts and messages from Leopold. They would bow before the little Infanta and comment on her grace and beauty. Behind their polite words was an unspoken truth: they were inspecting her. She was livestock for dynastic breeding. Leopold, meanwhile, had already expressed his satisfaction with the arrangement. He had seen her portraits and written warmly of his beloved niece and bride. To him, the marriage was ideal. It preserved the Habsburg line and solidified his claim to Spanish inheritance. But he did not consider her feelings. He did not ask whether she wanted this life. For Habsburgs, there was no such thing as personal choice. While others saw promise, Margarita saw isolation. Her tutors described her as obedient, but melancholic. She rarely smiled without being told to. She often sat alone for hours, staring out the windows of the Alcazar, watching birds fly free while she remained caged in protocol. She would later refer to her early years as long silences and stiff dresses. Her health continued to decline during these crucial formative years. She suffered from chronic fatigue, recurring fevers, and digestive problems. Court physicians prescribed strange treatments, bleeding, herbal poultices, and long periods of enforced rest. None of it helped. The real cause of her ailments was ignored. Generations of inbreeding had riddled her body with hidden deformities. Despite her illness, plans for her departure to Vienna continued. She would not leave until she turned 15, but the preparations were already underway. Paintings of her were sent ahead to Leopold, each one touched up to hide her sickliness. Tailors crafted dresses fit for an empress. Dowries were negotiated down to the last coin. Every detail was considered, except the emotional well-being of the girl at the center of it all. During these years, Margarita received letters from Leopold. They were formal, affectionate, and full of flattery. He called her my shining star, my cherished bride, and the future of Christendom. But behind the flowery words was a man twice her age preparing to marry his niece. In any other family, this would be scandal. In the Habsburg court, it was tradition. Court gossip sometimes whispered about the danger of the union. Privately, some nobles expressed concern that Margarita looked too pale, too thin, too weak. But they were silenced by loyalty or fear. No one dared defy the will of the Habsburg kings. The family had made incest a policy, and Margarita was the living proof. Her brother, Carlos, had been born in 1661, the long-awaited male heir. But even as a baby, Carlos showed signs of severe deformity. His tongue was too large for his mouth. He could not feed properly. He suffered seizures and showed cognitive delays. The court was alarmed. Mariana prayed. Philip IV aged faster. And Margarita, meanwhile, was now more valuable than ever. If Carlos did not survive, Margarita's marriage to Leopold could unite both thrones. Spain and Austria could become one under a single Habsburg bloodline. And so, pressure mounted. The court no longer saw her as a daughter. She was the last hope of a crumbling empire. At 13, Margarita began menstruating, a moment that was not treated with privacy, but public interest. It was announced to the court that she was now fit for marriage. Church bells rang. Physicians rejoiced. Ambassadors sent dispatches to Vienna. The Infanta is now a woman. But was she? Inside, she was still a girl. Fragile, uncertain, and frightened. She did not want to leave Spain. She was deeply attached to her younger siblings and her nursemates. She was afraid of the long journey, of the coldness of the Austrian court, and of the strange uncle she barely knew but was being forced to marry. In 1666, the final preparations for her journey began. She was 15 years old. Her father, Philip IV, had died the year before, leaving her mother Mariana as regent. Margarita wept often. She begged not to be sent away. But her tears were meaningless to the machinery of empire. A grand procession was organized. She would travel from Madrid to Vienna by carriage, escorted by nobles, servants, and guards. The journey would take months. Along the way, she would be displayed like a jewel, paraded through cities, admired by strangers, bowed to by peasants. Each stop reminded her of the burden she carried. At her final departure, she kissed her gates closed behind her. And the long road to her doom began. The long journey from Madrid to Vienna began in early 1666. Margarita Teresa, now 15 years old, traveled with a vast entourage through Spain, Italy, and the Alpine passes. The roads were rough, the weather unpredictable, and the journey exhausting. Her carriage was richly decorated but painfully cramped. She spent weeks bouncing across jagged roads, her body weakened by illness and stress. At every city along the route, she was paraded before nobility, her image praised, her silence expected. The girl inside the golden carriage had already begun to disappear. What remained was a shell molded by centuries of dynastic greed. She wrote letters during her travels, polite, distant, and carefully censored. In them, she expressed gratitude, obedience, and love for a future she did not choose. But behind the courtly language, her heart trembled. She was headed not to a husband, but to an uncle. Not to a new life, but to a new prison. On December 5, 1666, Margarita arrived in Vienna. The city was frozen in winter, its gray sky draped over pointed rooftops and grand Gothic churches. The Habsburg palace stood cold and immense, like a cathedral built for power rather than comfort. She was greeted with fanfare, music, and cannon salutes. Nobles bowed. Crowds cheered. But inside her carriage, Margarita remained still, her eyes blank. She was now Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. The wedding ceremony was grand and theatrical. Margarita stood beside Leopold I, a man twice her age, dressed in armor and heavy brocade. He smiled softly as the priest blessed their union. She recited her vows in a trembling voice. The bells rang. The court celebrated. But for Margarita, the moment marked the end of whatever childhood she had left. Her first nights as a bride were filled with anxiety and discomfort. Leopold, though gentle by court standards, still expected a wife, an empress, and eventually, a mother. But Margarita's body was not ready. She was plagued by stomach pain, nausea, and recurring fevers. Servants reported that she wept often at night. Her letters home became more cryptic. She spoke of heavy burdens, and asked for prayers. The Viennese court was far colder than the Spanish one. The climate was harsh, and the people more reserved. Though she had a Spanish entourage, most of her daily life was controlled by Austrian customs. She struggled with the language. She disliked the food. And most painfully, she missed her mother and siblings. Her isolation became a prison without visible bars. She fulfilled her duties with mechanical precision. She attended Mass daily, hosted formal dinners, and appeared in ceremonial processions. Her gowns were dazzling, her posture flawless, but her eyes betrayed her fatigue. Court painters flattered her with glowing portraits, but visitors often remarked that she looked ghostly. She had become the perfect symbol of dynastic unity, and of its cost. Despite her physical weakness, Margarita became pregnant in 1667. Her first child, a daughter, was born in January 1669. But the baby was sickly and died before her first birthday. The loss shattered her. She had been raised to be a mother queen, and now her body had failed the one purpose it had been trained for. Margarita's health spiraled after that. She suffered from fainting spells, migraines, and unexplained swelling. Her skin turned gray. She began losing weight rapidly. Physicians tried everything: leeching, purging, and bizarre herbal concoctions. Nothing worked. The Habsburg body was collapsing from within. Still, the pressure to bear an heir remained. She became pregnant again in 1670. This time, the pregnancy lasted, and she gave birth to a healthy daughter named Maria Antonia. It was a brief moment of joy. But it came at a terrible cost. Margarita never fully recovered. Her internal organs were damaged, and her strength never returned. She remained bedbound for weeks. Her hair began to fall out in clumps. Yet even in this fragile state, she was forced to appear at court. She smiled through pain. She bowed while bleeding. She danced with death at her heels. The empress was breaking, but the empire demanded she continue. Leopold, to his credit, showed her some affection. He wrote her music and poems. He brought her gifts. But he did not stop the expectations placed upon her. He was emperor first, husband second. And the dynasty came before both. Margarita's letters to her mother became increasingly sorrowful. She asked about her siblings, about Spain, about memories of walking in the palace gardens. She begged to see them again. She knew it would not happen. The roads were long. Her body was weak. And her place, like her fate, was fixed. By 1672, Margarita was only 21, but she looked much older. Her spine had curved noticeably. Her complexion was yellowed. She coughed blood into handkerchiefs. She could no longer walk unassisted. She could barely speak above a whisper. The physicians still did not name her illness. They called it female weakness. But it was something far deeper, the collapse of a life that was never allowed to be whole. She gave birth once more in 1672, a premature child who died shortly after. The labor nearly killed her. She lost massive amounts of blood and never recovered. By now, even the courtiers whispered openly, the empress was dying. But still she was made to attend state functions. Still she wore jewels and lace. Still she sat beside her husband as a symbol of strength. The image had to be preserved, even if it killed her. One portrait from this time shows her seated beside Leopold, draped in a red velvet robe. Her eyes are dark, sunken, and distant. Her hands are thin and curled inward, too weak to rest flat. She is only 21. But she looks like a ghost. And so the girl raised for incest, the princess born to preserve a bloodline, now sat in the middle of Europe's greatest empire, slowly dying from the very legacy she was bred to uphold. By the year 1673, Margarita Teresa of Spain was fading fast. The once celebrated child princess of Las Meninas, the little girl raised like a porcelain doll, was now a shell of a woman, barely able to rise from her bed. She was 22 years old. Her bones ached constantly. Her organs were failing. Her complexion was gray and waxen, and her once glorious hair had thinned so dramatically that wigs became necessary even in private. Her husband, Emperor Leopold I, became increasingly concerned, but even his concern had limits. Though he visited her bedside and ordered the best physicians of the empire, he continued to host court events, conduct diplomacy, and seek assurances that Margarita would recover enough to bear more children. His empire needed heirs. Her survival was not just personal, it was political. But everyone knew. Everyone could see it in her face, in her stillness, in her haunting, quiet presence. The empress was dying, not from one illness, but from a lifetime of inherited curses. From the day of her birth, she had been weighed down by a dynasty's desperation to keep its bloodline pure. Her body was simply collapsing under the genetic burden of centuries of incest. The Habsburg jaw, the curved spine, the weak lungs, the narrow pelvis that made childbirth nearly fatal. Each trait passed down from cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, until nature itself began to rebel. Margarita was the most tragic expression of a dynasty in decline. She had fulfilled her purpose, and it had broken her. The Austrian court prepared for the inevitable. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, was now the new jewel of the dynasty. Barely 3 years old, she was already being groomed for marriage. Margarita could barely hold the child in her arms. Her fingers trembled too much. Her arms had lost strength. And in her eyes was a distant sorrow, not just for herself, but for the fate her daughter might inherit. In letters to her mother Mariana, Margarita no longer wrote of her duties. She wrote of dreams, of childhood memories, of the scent of jasmine in the Spanish gardens. She wrote of wanting to be buried in Spain. She wrote of her regrets. Not of marrying her uncle. She never criticized the empire. But of never having lived for herself. Of never having been a child. Of never having had freedom. On March 12, 1673, the imperial palace fell into silence. Doctors were summoned before dawn. Margarita had lost consciousness. Her pulse was faint. She was surrounded by clergy, maids, and a weeping Leopold. In her final moments, she was said to have whispered something in Spanish. No one remembered the words. No one recorded them. Then, at just 21 years and 8 months old, the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire slipped away. The court went into mourning. Black drapes covered the palace halls. Masses were held across Vienna and Madrid. Poets praised her grace and purity. Diplomats mourned the loss of a bridge between kingdoms. But no one mourned the loss of Margarita Teresa the person, the girl who once laughed quietly in the halls of the Alcazar, who once begged not to be sent away, who once sat too long in the painter's chair as Velázquez immortalized her childhood. Her body was embalmed and entombed in the imperial crypt in Vienna. But her soul, if one believes in such things, never rested in Austria. She had always belonged to Spain. To the sunlit gardens she longed for. To the family she was forced to leave. To a country that raised her for sacrifice. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, would grow up frail, sickly, and haunted by the same genetic legacy. She too would be married off for political reasons. And she too would die young.